Hey everyone, this is Nick Diobertis teaching you financial modeling. Today I'm going to be answering some student questions on Project 4. So the first question that we have is, what variables should I include in the Monte Carlo simulation? So you want to try to include the most impactful variables in your model. Now, depending on how you set things up, and depending on your company, that's going to change which variables those are. Now, I would say that generally using more variables is better. If you could run the simulation on every single input in your model, that would be ideal. But that's also a substantial challenge to set up all that infrastructure. And some of those inputs may not have much of an impact. And so it's not very high value to target all of those. Um, so, if your company is mostly equity financed, certainly you would want to make sure that inputs like beta and the market return are in the simulation. If they're heavily debt financed, then your inputs into the cost of debt and market value of debt are going to be more important to be in there. Um, One that you should essentially always have is the terminal growth rate for the perpetuity growth method for the terminal value. That assumption tends to change the resulting stock price by quite a bit, and so I would always recommend including that in simulations as well as the sensitivity analysis. Um, and you want to try to include assumptions which are going into your forecasting as well. Maybe you have assumed a certain growth rate for the revenue, and a number of things are forecasted as a percentage of revenue. So that is a very impactful assumption in your model. Then you would certainly want to include that revenue growth rate in the simulations as well. So it's worth it to just go through your model and try changing around some inputs and see how much of an impact it has on the stock price. If it's fairly large, then that is something you should include in the simulation. If it makes very little impact, then there's not a lot of value to add it. It won't hurt. It's always better to include more variables, but considering everyone has limited time, I would prioritize those which have the biggest impact on the stock price. So the next question is, should I use annual or quarterly financial statements? So it certainly is a little bit more challenging to use quarterly financial statements, but you can get a little bit more accurate result as well. Um, so that's something that, as far as the grading is concerned, using quarterly financials would earn you a bonus, but it also can add a fair bit of complication to your project as well. I would say that most DCF models I see are using annual. That's kind of the standard, but you can get a little bit more accurate by using quarterly, and really getting a deeper understanding of the seasonality of the company's operations and modeling that appropriately. Um, it's more complicated to work with the quarterly financials, mainly because of that seasonality effect. Some companies aren't going to have that, but the majority do. And so that moves you from a simple time series world into a complex time series world. And so you have to use methods which are geared towards these more complex time series and can handle the seasonality inherent in most quarterly financials. Um, so that's why I say you would earn a bonus for um, using the quarterly, because you have to go to these complex time series methods. Um, and then one other thing you'll have to consider is, once you go to you'll have to think about everything in terms of quarters, right? 4 per year. And so if you want a 5 year forecast, you need to forecast 20 periods there. Um, and when you think about um, if you want to get the net income for the year, well, you have to sum all the 4 quarters in the year. So um, these things, little things, working with the quarterly financials are a little bit more complicated. Um, so if you want to just get the model done, I would recommend just going with annual. It's going to be substantially simpler. But if you want to perform at the highest level and have a little bit more accurate model, then it makes sense to go for the quarterly financials. So the last question here is, how should I approach the write-up around the forecasting assumptions? Um, so there's really two different um, stages as you go through the forecasting. So one first stage is that you just want to be able to predict the future in a way that makes sense based upon the historical values. So does, when you look at a plot of the forecasted versus the historical, does it look like the historical naturally leads to the future forecasted? Is there a pattern there which is being continued? Um, so that's kind of the first step in the forecasting process. You want to select the methods for each statement item such that you see that these historical patterns are repeated in the future. And you can consider that kind of the original baseline forecast. So there will be a write up for that component in terms of what, why did you choose the forecasting methods for each of the line items, and that's where you're talking about historical data and how you had to use different methods to fit the data. Um, such as, say it was very flat, and then there's a jump, and then it's flat again. Um, it might make more sense to use the recent value approach to say, well, it's just going to stay at the new level. So you can kind of talk through that in the write up. Um, well, it was flat and then it jumped and then it was flat again. And so I went with the recent value approach because it seems like that value is going to stay at that level in the future. So that's the first stage of the forecasting. And then the second stage is, well, I have kind of basically this naive forecast, which is only thinking about the historical financials and not incorporating any kind of information that we have about the company's operations in the future or about economic conditions that are changing or other world events. So the second stage is where you take all this qualitative information about the company that you uncover through your research and your thinking and your analysis, um, and you want to incorporate that into the forecast. Um, so maybe, for example, just say that the company you're analyzing is Pfizer, um, and your historical data is basically pre COVID-19 timeframe. Well, we can't really just assume that the historical is going to predict the future now that we've had COVID come into the situation and kind of switch things up a lot for the company. Um, so you may want to go and read about the rollout of their vaccine, and kind of the distribution plans and how much revenue they plan to bring in from all this distribution, and work that into your forecast. So it would be good to go and read different disclosures that the company has put out, such as 10K, 10Q, and any other disclosures that are relevant. And see the company's plans, see their estimates, and critically evaluate their estimates, to see if you think it would be different, and then take that knowledge that you've learned about the company and work that into your forecast. well, now they have all this additional demand with the vaccine. So maybe you're going to boost the revenue growth for the next couple of years. Um, and that's not something you could ever get by just looking at the historical data and just using the time series to predict the future. Um, so this would be more of the bulk of the write up for most people. Is what qualitative information have you uncovered about your company, uh, which changes how we should think about what's going to happen in the future. Um, there's not going to be any right or wrong answers on these things. It is ultimately your opinion about what's going to happen in the future, but it should be a logical analysis. The uh, you should be kind of trying to break down the news or expectations for the future of the company and trying to analyze how that will impact the financial statements, and then justifying the adjustments that you've made to the financial statements by that way. Um, so you'll have a little bit on, well, I chose the recent value for this item, I chose the trend for this item, etc. You could say, well, I go with a default for Kaggle, and then I've changed it for these certain items. And then you say, but beyond the baseline forecast, then I adjusted revenue up, 10% for the next 2 years because of this vaccine rollout, and give a lot more detail there of why you think 10% is an appropriate number based on the disclosures, and make sure you're incorporating what other impacts that's going to have on the financial statements. Well, now, they need additional logistics to ship all these vaccines around the world quickly. So their, operating costs for those logistics are going to increase proportionately. So you want to just think through all of the information that you've gathered about your company and how that can affect all the different statement line items. And that will be the bulk of your write up around the forecast assumptions. So that's all the questions that I had for today on Project 4 from the students. Um, and definitely feel free to send me questions on any topics throughout the course, either by email, which you can find the email on the channel page, or you can also feel free to comment on videos and I can reply there as well. So thanks for listening and see you next time.